AI is consuming the internet, scraping content, generating responses, and reshaping how we search for and interact with information. But there's a massive problem: who gets paid? In this episode, I sit down with Hirsh Pithadia, CEO and co-founder of Valyu Networks, to discuss how content creators, publishers, and businesses can monetize their data in the age of AI. Hey Harsh, hi, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hey Vishesh, great to kind of meet you and appreciate you for having me.
Awesome, great to have you. AI bots are consuming content like crazy. Everybody's training models, but they don't click on ads, they don't subscribe, and they don't buy. And on top of it, the world is running out of training data. So, in a nutshell, there is a data problem, there is an engagement problem. Everybody's looking through the crystal ball to figure out what's going to happen, how is all of this going to shake up. In that context, what does Value do and why now?
That's a very great and sort of question there, Vishesh. I'll unpack every sort of bit of it. So, we're building value, and essentially the way I like to say it is value is building the content monetization rail. What exactly does this mean? Let me unpack it by the problem statement here that we're working on, specific problems and pain points that everyone has kind of experiencing in this ecosystem. A few years ago, when you went to something like a Google, or when you're looking for information online, you'd open Google, type in your question, you get your top links, you click on them, and it takes you to a blog or a news article or a video. And in doing so, by clicking on the link, you'd actually go and start sort of traffic through something called pay-per-click. This entire sort of search process is completely different now. What you now do, you go to your chat GPT, it's fantastic. You go ask a question, it gives you an answer instant. It's synthesized everything. But what's happened is there's very few links, there's no ads, there's no visit sources, there's no citations. You've got your answer, but the people who actually created this content actually don't kind of get paid from it. So naturally, the question arises, what exactly is the monetization model of this? And that is the problem that we're trying to solve. Now, it did have its genesis in training an AI server engineer or a model developer. You'd kind of train your models. You'd go and crawl literally the whole internet, mine data, kind of build your models. But that's the sort of starting point. Now things have moved slightly towards inference as well. If you want to add search features to your models and stuff, the premise of the crux of the problem is still the same. So that is what we're trying to solve essentially. How do we allow content platforms to monetize the data for AI?
I actually met Alex, your co-founder, in San Francisco, and we spoke a little bit about the journey. How did you guys start, and what's the genesis of Valyu?
Well, kind of give an intro to our backgrounds because that kind of fits into kind of got started. I've got a technical background, did a couple of postdocs at UCL, University College London, and a lot of my research work has been centered around deep learning and information retrieval, but more specifically the problem space of identifying how useful is a data set to train a model. So what's useful within this data set. Before that, did a doctoral research in federated learning and stuff. But the important thing over here was I was in this sort of research lab. A lot of my peers were in other sort of research labs and research groups like Meta's Fair. There's actually DeepMind was from UCL as well. But it was about 2.5-ish years ago that when you see your peers working on model scaling or stuff thereof, you start to think about things from your perspective. What I mean by this is the Kaplan paper came out about 2.5, 3 years ago. So the Kaplan paper was essentially one of the first papers talking about model scaling. To scale AGI, you need three things. You need compute, you need data, you need architecture. A lot of my peers are looking into compute and architecture, kind of optimizations thereof in the architecture. Me being from the data-centric side, I was always thinking, why is no one thinking about data? Because if you kind of if the scaling laws were kind of to hold, at some, what's learnable from the web is going to diminish. So firstly, how are we kind of go actually get new, what they call frontier data, solve this problem? Is it just proprietary data that you have to go and look for, to publishers and stuff that's behind paywalls? But then the other sort of perspective I had was, hold on a minute, it's the web and content is the lifeblood of the web. So what exactly happens when, you've got this perpetual need for data clearly there's some sort of covenant that needs to be created between those that create the data and those that sort of train the models that use it for some ML perspective. So these sort of ideas that I'd start to really think about. And that's sort of met Alex, my co-founder, and he has a background in information retrieval research labs as myself. And we really started to go down this rabbit hole. So from a very technical perspective, what would it mean to kind of scale such a system? What exactly does it mean to kind of build that scale? Because clearly naive RAG does not work. Is there some sort of hybrid stuff we can play around with? How throw this hundreds of millions of vectors? There were all these first principles bit of research work that we started doing. And it was only after years of doing research work we were confident enough to say, hey, you know what? Okay, now answered a lot of the first principle of questions that we had. Now to go and build a product and kind of test it out. So that's how we really got started. Now we've got one more co-founder, Harvey, the youngest artist. He's about 2021-ish. Well, super young, but he's one of those guys, a brilliant sort of engineer. And yeah, he just likes to build stuff as well. And yeah, still does a lot of very sort of good research as well.
Interesting.
And that's pretty much how we got started. We were working on this problem, it just felt natural.
So all three of you met in the research setting, and then
Yeah. The funny thing is, Alex and Harvey met at a hackathon, and they were competing against each other. It was completely separately, but yeah.
Data is definitely a problem. I don't know if you've heard recently. I think this week the news broke. Meta apparently was gobbling all the books from torrents and Pirate Bay.
Yeah. No. So the story is, at some point, in the early days of the Llama models, basically, they needed new training tokens, and they were debating on whether to actually go and even buy publishing houses. Again, I don't know how true this is, just a rumor, but I suspect they might have got it from other places, but who knows? Yeah. But one thing I will mention, Vishesh, is that it's nice kind of working and building in a space. There's something that's happening in the news every day that's almost related or relevant to what you're doing.
Yep.
So it's always not. It's nice, but it's also you need to focus. So yeah, it's something we wrestle with often. So yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to zone in and not get distracted for sure. Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised if they were thinking of buying a publishing house, by the way. They bought a VPN or a proxy service earlier to snoop on users. So they have the money and the muscle. And so you are trying to, can you talk a little bit about how the monetization works from an execution point of view?
So there's two ways to look at it. There is a direct monetization and indirect monetization. I'll start off with the direct. We initially used to work in this sort of training data space rather than the context enrichment data space. Now, training data is a bit simple to understand. You've got your data, massive corpora collection of books or videos or audio, etc. Licensing these, AI companies. It's a sort of massive deal, and you take a small, take rate. So that was the sort of early sort of starting point we had. But what we realized with this model was training data is very limited in the sense that once you train some sort of model, there's only so many times you can sell a data set with model distillation and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Where things become very interesting is with charge whenever data is served during inference. To answer a query or a context, to enrich a context. So the way we work is anytime a context is enriched, we charge a small sort of fee. So at the moment, we charge per 1,000 queries, which is about $30. So very sort of microtransactions, and we charge direct. There is an indirect sort of model as well that is on our roadmap, can we do something like do a pay-per-click monetization model? We provide a link and someone clicks on it and kind of get a referral. You've probably experienced this with knowing what I mean by this, Vishesh, is that if you go to ChatGPT today or some of these chat-based models, oftentimes you may ask it, especially if ask it, could you give me the news of what happened, for example, in the US today? In some cases, it's going to browse the web, probably not browsing the web. It's actually going to, its data or content partners and saying, this is Vishesh. He needs the news. What they'll do, give the model a full sort of story about the news. the model will go and create a nice summary, and you will be presented with a summary, but more importantly, you'll be presented with an attribution.
Mhm.
Now, the attribution serves two purposes. The first one is obviously kind of induces trust in the response because you know where it's coming from. But the second bit is more sort of subtle, but arguably more important, which you go and click on that link, and that can be monetized through some sort of pay-per-clicks model. So that's what I mean by an indirect sort of monetization model. It's similar to how a lot of content is monetized on the web. Yeah. Another sort of technique that we're thinking on an indirect monetization model, other than pay-per-clicks, stuff to do with keywords. Can you enrich stuff with keywords on a context window or not?
What do you mean by enrich things using a keyword?
So this is quite similar to how search works on Google, which is let's go to. Let me give a proper example. Let's say you want a recipe of a fancy pizza that's never been on the training data set ever, and you ask this model, "Hey, could you give me this recipe of fancy pizza?" It's probably going to go to because it's not in its training set. It most likely is going to go to its content partner and say she wants this sort of fancy pizza. It'll give you the sort of recipe. But the interesting thing is, wherever there is any sort of reference to the word mozzarella, that could be flipped, and it could have, I don't know, something like a Tesco's fine pizza, a text kind of embedded it and add very subtly within the sort of response,
Right.
kind of nudge the sort of user. So that's what I mean when I
So more like
and context bidding.
an ad network, keyword based ad.
Exactly, exactly. And one thing I will mention is this data space or data marketplace or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of parallels between how ads evolved, the whole sort of bidding stuff, to how this ecosystem is currently. And there is enough empirical evidence to believe that, this space is going to evolve the same way ad networks and ad markets evolve.
Yeah, makes sense. Something has to be figured out because even with the click model, the traffic will drastically reduce, right? People, because they're getting a good enough summary on the
Yep.
on the screen with an attribution, the rate at which people do click on the attribution is radically low compared to when they click on Google.
Yep. Yep. Although one interesting thing is the strength of the conversions after that are actually a lot more stronger. That's something that they've actually, yeah, super interesting. There's one other thing that I wanted to mention is it's not even about showing the content to the end user. That's a bit more simple to understand. But what about in a sort of a post-agentic web? A large population of the web's users become having agents that do stuff, browse stuff, make buying decisions, and they're responsible for a large part, the traffic. Do you show ads to them, or what happens there? So these are questions we do think quite deeply about.
Making it more amenable for them to click and buy stuff. Is that a possibility? Given they are going to be making purchasing decisions,
Yep.
one would assume those decisions would be based on data and some cross references to fact check that data, because you can easily generate fake data as well. Now, given that they are going to be taking those decisions, it makes sense that there has to be a monetization model on top of it, because that purchase is going to happen.
We're seeing some early elements of that. The whole perplexity commerce thing that's happening alludes briefly to that, like vaguely to that. You've got some sort of agent or something that's going and buying stuff, or thinking about buying stuff. So it's inevitable. Question is, what exactly does it look like? So yeah, the one thing I will mention, especially with agents and bots, is when it comes to buying and buying decisions, they're not irrational like humans, so they might be easier to sell to. At least that's what I think. So
There's no biases.
yeah.
Knowledge from the Cialdinis of the world is out the window. You spoke about conversion of attribution having a higher conversion. Is that based on what you've seen so far, or is there research as well that you've come across?
So we've seen elements on the work that we have done. Physical evidence of working in this space. Perplexity. Actually, I think one of the blogs has talked about this as well. Don't quote me. It could be on a Reddit thread, kind of. So, but, I have had a lot of conversations with people building in this space. sort of echoes that same sentiment. So it's just something empirical out there.
I do see, at least now personally, when I look at some of the summarization, and if something does pique my interest in terms of data point and has an attribution, one reason I do click on that for sure is because just to freaking fact check whether whatever is being pulled is actually making sense. And many times, unfortunately, it doesn't make sense, which worries me a little bit, to be really honest. And this is specifically on Perplexity. I have had that happen multiple times on Perplexity, like in the last month and a half. So yeah,
I think
hopefully things improve.
no, hopefully I've started using a lot of u.com recently. I don't know, for some reason, Perplexity has, I want to say, diminished in terms of the quality of its responses, but it's just something that I feel like I've experienced, in terms of the quality of the responses, but maybe it's just some sort of bug or something. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe. And this seems like an inflection point, right? Timing seems to be ripe for something like this. What are some of the challenges in attacking such a fast moving problem?
I think just building in a the biggest challenge we all kind of experience or wrestle with is you've got two worlds sort of colliding, whereas, you've, content and publishing and platforms. These guys move at a somewhat glacial pace.
Yep.
And then you've got the AI sort of developers and companies, they're just building at an incredibly fast pace. If you told me about 3 months ago that what context enrichment might be something that happens so soon, I would have said maybe not. The whole DeepSeek stuff that's been out there, like, it really kind of pushes for that sort of model. So especially sort of the, deep, much more sort of deep responses. So what I'm trying to say, Vishesh, is building in a space that's evolving so quickly is something that we wrestle with often, because it's not just about the product, but who are your users, how they're going to use it. But all, you've got another part of the users, which is somewhat of a traditional publisher, and of go and communicate and explain to them, hey, you know what? You should not be thinking about training data. You should actually be thinking about providing a data for context enrichment, which is something that, from a feed view, seems like it's very new and doesn't seem to work. It's very experimental. But these are all the sorts of questions that we really kind of think about and tackle on a day-to-day basis. As a startup, you also learn, firstly, focus, but thinking of which fights to pick on and which fights not to pick on. And which problems to work on, which problems not to work on. So it becomes a multivariate problem to think of. Yeah. So it's something we kind of think of. Yeah. In terms of how we prioritize things, it's just speaking to our users and customers pretty much. In one sense, I want to say the biggest user group, the biggest customer group we have is actually the AI developers. Them wanting data, and that does make, in one perspective, our job a bit more easier, because we are the ones building these mods. We were the ones building these applications and stuff. So you can easily kind of understand their headspace, the problems they're working for, and there is some degree of familiarity. So it's sort of really prioritize things based on what the AI developers want to think of, how they're thinking of things.
Obviously, familiar space, easier to understand the problem statement from their point of view.
Yeah.
So a lot of data is now also generated using AI. If you just draw this out further, licensing not only data from these publishing house and people who own the data, but also eventually licensing data that is generated by AI. Have you come across, like, what are your thoughts? Is it even licensable? Have you come across more literature on what's happening there?
So when it comes to, one way to look at it, data generated by AI is pretty much what kind of called synthetic data.
Right.
And it's been around a very, very long time. And it's actually been used a lot in sort of training models, especially maybe not in this pre-train, post pre-training, some fine-tuning in there also. So they do kind of use synthetic data there. So it's already in use in the sort of training phases. So there's definitely that, but alluded to something sort of interesting sort of happening as well, which is, if a large portion of the very, very soon starts to become inundated with AI generated content, a question is, what exactly does that mean? Firstly, for the web as a data source for training model, and how does that impact things like model performance? And it's got all these sorts of high degree knock-on effects. As you've got things like model collapse that they do say they can have model collapse is essentially training a model on synthesized data that is used to train another model that's used to synthesize another. Like, you kind of do this for a few generations, and all of a sudden you just see the performance drop. Now, the argument here being, if you kind of go a few generations of this on, some of the foundational models on training data off the web, like what exactly does that mean, the overall model performance and stuff? One way we think of it is there's always going to be a need for premium or organic data, and people will want to pay a premium for this. The question is, what mechanism allows you to acquire and get this premium data? That's one of the kind of way kind of think of it as well. And we're already starting to experience this, Vishesh. I think there was this article going around that's 55% of LinkedIn posts are AI generated. Like, we're already experiencing some flavors of this, but still to make sort of informed opinion about where it's going to head, and the implications of AI generated data and how this impacts everything. So yeah.
Even in the AI generated data, there are two buckets, right? One is where there is attribution that this is AI generated, and then there is AI generated that is passed off as human generated, and you are already seeing some of that happening on LinkedIn, for example, on other social media, where a lot of content is AI generated, even though it's attributed to a human. And so my question was more on that front. How do you, if humans start passing off AI generated content as data as human generated, then it seems like the degradation is going to happen sooner rather than later. That's what it.
I think one think about there is basically, I don't want to say easy, but there are mechanisms to detect, AI generated text. Like, even if humans do pass up their content as human generate. If this becomes a sort of big, if I'm someone kind of building a model or training a model, this is one additional check kind of just put on top of my sort of training stuff. Is this AI generated or not? And have some sort of filter or some filtering mechanism. So that's how I think of it. Now, to what degree this works is still early days, but it's definitely going to be a sort of a problem.
Yeah, it's a challenging time for sure for people dealing with this. And so, from a scale point of view, what kind of scale are you already hitting, or is it still too early in terms of the amount of data you're processing?
We don't work in a few terabyte scale. We've never done that. Since the early days of the company, we've always worked in hundreds of terabytes, even petabytes in some cases, especially for things like video and modalities there. So we've, I want to say, worked at scale from day dot. But
Yeah.
what that has meant for us is how we build and engineer these systems has always been something we do often from first principles, more than we'd like. Kind of walk you, how, our infrastructure for context enrichment, for example, when kind of think about scale at that size, and then kind of ground it down to something like, archives sort of data set. For now, it's a few terabytes. I think it's about 10 to 12-ish terabytes, but kind of walk you through something that's a lot bigger. Now, when we're building context enrichment for something like an archive data set, we essentially need to build a massive sort of index and do all the sort of RAG-based chunking and all that kind of stuff. Any sort of typical process thereof has a few sort of key areas. You've got extraction, you've got chunking, you've got embedding, you've got clustering, and then you've got your sort of indexing. So you've got these sort of steps at a high level. Extraction for us, when you're thinking of that scale, is already a very big problem because you're talking about PDF data. And how we do our extraction, we've had to build all our own sort of custom pipelines, custom models to help us do this. Pipelines, helping the distributed extraction across a massive sort of cluster. Have, some of the models that we've kind of used. So we've had to train our own models, sort of latex to sort of latex sort of conversion. Because a lot of the kind of archive data sets have a lot of equations and stuff, so we had to kind of train our own sort of models there, run them, really optimize them at that scale. So that was a sort of extraction phase. Requires a lot of compute. Then, comes chunking. Again, how do you kind of think about chunking, especially when your corpus is so massive, across multiple domains, and, you can't do something that's naive. You have to do something more sort of semantic chunking. That's what they call it. So how do you kind of figure out chunking at that scale? And then, you have to then kind of think about things like embedding. Now, embedding is quite interesting because, again, we had to train our own embeddings models, kind of do this for the level that we wanted. It's sort of brilliant at this kind of sets of problems. So, he's created our own sort of custom embeddings models and stuff like that. And then you have to think of what if we put this into production, which you have to worry about, how much it's going to cost you in terms of how many sort of tokens are you going to sort of embed and all that sort of stuff as well. It's not just about the training, it's about you putting this in, production as well. Then comes clustering and indexing, which are, you could say, the last sort of step, how to kind of build your indices, because this is a massive data set across multiple domains. How you build your index informs how you can retrieve stuff. If it's a query on, for example, could you tell me what a transformer architecture is? Now, the word transformer could actually mean the AI, so the architecture for transformers, how some of these models work. But also the word transformer could mean, something like the transformer, the one that kind of steps up and steps.
Or the movie.
Oh, the movie, yeah. If you kind of have that domain, so kind of build the index and where you go and kind of retrieval happen, kind of think about all these things. So we've had to figure a lot of these things out literally from first principle. I want to say, Vishesh, we're also builders and engineers, and this is something really excites us, working at this sort of scale and level. And I've told you just that, something that's a few terabytes, 10 to 12, you kind of have to kind of throw this to tens or hundreds of terabytes, which is a completely different sort of, I don't say completely different, a step beyond. So yeah, this is pretty much how we scale kind of such a capacity.
All this obviously costs money, and you guys started from uni.
Yeah.
How are you funding this, and have you raised money already?
So yeah, we actually did start from uni. We were fortunate enough to use some of their sort of computed resources and stuff. So it was not on a bootstrap then. But very early on, we've always had this attitude where we want to work with really like strong constraints, especially when it comes to compute. What I mean by this, some of the stuff that we've optimized. A good example is kind of store our index. We store it on S3. We actually don't store it in memory. And that gives us a massive sort of cost reduction. So we've kind of think about all these things too when it comes to optimizing costs with the constraints that we have. So how to thought about our sort of fundraise and all that kind of stuff is a very sort of interesting stuff. I mentioned the very first year of the company, we were just doing research work about all these sorts of problems, wrote paper, kind of do a lot of research work in this area. But around this time last year is when we were fortunate enough to do our sort of pre-seed round. And that, gave us a bit more sort of, you could say, set of resources of work from. But one thing I will mention is we're still of the mindset of let's just be a little sort of scrappy about how we think about, put all these sorts of constraints, because that is actually really helping us. One thing I will mention is, as a business, we're in the business of, we've got a margins business. So wherever we can identify costs, because our business model is on a take rate basis. So the more cost optimization we do, it impacts our sort of our top line directly. So we have to think about all these things. That's one kind of think of. It's actually one of those stories where being at the right place at the right time really does matter. I think it was around this time last year, about Feb. A16Z had just opened their sort of London office, and one of the partners, Chris Dixon, a general partners, had come over to promote his sort of new book. Our office is just about 10 minutes away, so during one lunch, Harvey, my other co-founder, was like, "Hey, you know what? There's this thing happening at A16Z. Do you want to go? We can definitely go." So I was, "Do I want to go? Do I not?" He's like, "You know what? There's going to be free food, worst case. Like, there's going to be free lunch." I was like, "Sure, let's just go." So we ended up going. Everyone, Chris introduced his new book, and they were handing out free books. And Chris was also signing the books. I was, we've got a book, we might as well get it signed. So Harvey, queued up and had a book signed. So whilst he was signing the book, he just asked us, "What do you guys do?" So we kind of, gave him the 10-second thing about the problem that we're working on. This sounds super interesting. I think you should speak to one of the investment guys called Jay. Spoke with Jay, a couple of days later. really walked them through what we're building, the problem space, the implication. They asked us a lot of questions. I think by the end of that sort of conversation, it was clear that they wanted us to be part of their accelerator program. Yeah, literally a couple of days later, they would love to have you guys, gave us some money, and we were part of their, we were funded by their accelerator program. So, which was so and yeah, it was just being at the right place at the right time. At that point, we were not even looking to raise. I mean, we were going to be looking to raise a couple of months after, but it just happened, right place at the right time. And it was just a nice and interesting sort of story. Yeah. And, we've just been building off that momentum.
Nice. And so this is not speedrun. This is a different.
It's the CSX accelerator. Yeah.
Is that for a specific vertical or?
Yeah. So it's their crypto startup accelerator program. So the one bit that I've not mentioned is that the way the crypto element comes into us is with licensing and the rights clearing with a lot of these data sets, we tend to clear them on a blockchain. So we tend to do the sort of rights clearing on a blockchain.
So it's like a digital contract.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's a very sort of thin layer, but arguably underpins a core part of our sort of infrastructure.
Interesting.
But you as an end user, you just don't know that any of this stuff exists.
Yeah. That's the best way to do it. Hide the complexity.
Yeah, I've got this product philosophy. I've kind of stolen it from someone or kind of read it off somewhere. But the simpler the product, the more complex it is. And when you really think about it, it actually makes sense. I mean, think of Google. Yeah. It's just a window, with a search box. When you start kind of thinking about, the architecture and the complexity, and boom, it just hits you that, wow, this is very complex.
Yeah, absolutely. What's the next few months looking like for you guys? Are you raising again, or what are some of the challenges right now?
So we are definitely looking to raise. We're going to be doing our seed round. So that one of the things we want to do. In terms of other sort of challenges as well, one of the more challenges that we have at the moment is there's more and more people starting to build out in this ecosystem. So you're always going to be mindful of that. We've got the likes of Toolbit or Prorata that came, about a year ago, or slightly more. They're obviously a lot more well-funded than us. Question how kind of going to compete with these sort of startups and stuff there. So it's something we do think as one of the key areas that we kind of focus on. The other thing that we're really, really pushing for is more on the context enrichment side. Because, with the whole sort of test time stuff that's happening, context enrichment is starting to become a really big thing. And another sort of area that we're focusing on is moving more and more towards the US. We're a UK company and all, but we've pretty much had most of our users and customers, even on the content partner side, are literally from the US. So we just kind of be a lot more engaged in that sort of ecosystem. So that's something really kind of pushing for as well. Yeah.
And all three of you are techies, right?
Yeah.
How are you dividing the responsibility? Who's selling? Is Alex the one in SF trying to sell now, or who's the selling?
So the job of selling sits with me and Alex. At the moment, Alex really kind of also the kind of individual that kind of pushes for this as well. One other thing that Alex does, he's very sort of product centric. So it's always nice for him to kind of be based where all the users kind of understand how they kind of think things and, speak to them on a day-to-day sort of basis and understand stuff from them. So Alex definitely does a lot of stuff there as well. He's more does all the sort of engineering, building stuff, builds all the sort of infrastructure there. Kind of straddle both worlds, me sort of sell and all that kind of stuff. So that's where I am. We're all techie. One thing I will say, which sort of helped us, and it's something we underestimated to some capacity, was almost someone called us AI native, and I was actually thinking about this quite deep a few weekends ago. Because we're building for a space, it's constantly changing. You having a perspective of seeing how models have been built. Someone gone and worked in this space a very, very long time. Like the way you think, just the implications of what you build, why people would want it, trying to understand their problems, a feature set, a product matter. Kind of think of it from this perspective and lens. So I thought being AI native has really, really helped us. Yeah. The whole sort of test time stuff, context enrichment stuff is a good example. We knew of, from the early days, the chain of thought papers came out that this is how things are potentially going to go. So we were thinking about it from a very long time. So that really informed how we were doing stuff. So being this native, just being technical, as all three founders has sort of helped us. Ultimately, our sort of end users in one capacity are the people building, these AI systems or agents. So thinking like them does give you the product instincts that I think are very important.
Cool. We've reached the rapid fire. It's gonna be simple enough. I'll fire away. What's the one piece of advice for founders navigating an emerging industry?
I think industry, the way I think of it, often means you can't rely on things that have happened before to help you. What I mean by this is you have to always start to think of things from first principles, because first principles apply to everything, existing industries or emerging industries. What I like to say is if you're thinking of first principles, not just from engineering, but also from product, or even how you kind of figuring out your sort of business model, how you think about distribution and all that kind of stuff, that really sort of help is the whole first principles thought. So that's something that's very strong, resonated with us. Anything that we relies the sort of first principles approach. So they kind of encourage other fans to kind of think the things through from first principles. And you know what? Don't take things at sort of face value just because someone else has told you. Really think it through and question why it sits there. Really, and if it makes sense to you.
If you had to start over, what would you do differently? Still fairly early, so hopefully not a lot.
So, so there's two things that come to my mind currently, which is I'd actually listen to my gut a bit more about things, especially because of how this sort of ecosystem's evolving. When I mean my gut, as I mentioned, how I think of things as, the AI ecosystem is growing. I feel like we've been right about a lot of things, but we should have kind of doubled down on those things that were right. That often meant really thinking things through. So really kind of listening to your guts. I wish I kind of did that a bit more. Another thing is potentially kind of going or sort of building in America. The reality, at least, that what we've sort of experienced is Europe and the UK is great and all, but I think it's still somewhat glacial. And when you're working in an industry that's of just growing or accelerating at a pace like you've never seen anything accelerate, everything that's kind of touching that ecosystem needs to be kind of moving at that sort of vector as well. I think being in America, I think earlier on would have sort of really kind of allowed us to grow even further. So definitely, I think I should have done, or we should have kind of done that a lot more earlier. Yeah, yeah. And it's not just about the funding, but also getting the sort of users that you want, the product feedback that you want. It's all these things that really do matter. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the risk appetite is just a whole different.
I've got a personal philosophy for this. So I was actually born and brought up in Kenya and moved to Europe
Right.
when I was about 18 or 19, or the UK, and I spent a large part of my life there. So I want to say I'm almost like I'm an outsider. So one thing that I've seen when I think a bit more deeply through this, Europe and this sort of ecosystem, very, very sort of good at creating value. It's not so good at capturing value.
Hmm.
Creating value means, you're doing all the sort of first principles thinking, kind of doing a lot of the, academic or research work and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to, the systems and mechanisms to go and capture this value, build a product, give it to users, like, needs capital, but also, you need some sort of risk appetite in terms of people wanting to pay for it as well, try things out. And a lot of this sort of culture and mindset is very sort of, ingrained in the US, and it's something I really really experienced firsthand, and I was like, wow, okay. So yeah, it's creating value, capturing value. That's the way I kind of think of it as well. And I think it was Peter Thiel in one of his lectures that I was actually talking about, the whole thing about creating and capturing value. And yeah, I kind of did kind of really think about it from Europe and US perspective as well.
Yep, definitely the place to be. Book or resource that shaped your thinking as a company or as a founder.
Very, very sort of deep question, because I do read very industrially. I can go on. Here's two sort of resources that I go back to often. They're not exactly books, but a collection of blogs or blog articles that I really like. The one I often find myself reading and rereading is Sam Altman Startup Playbook. It's so simple. It's a nice little blog article. It just breaks down things so simply. And that's something I often do, kind of find myself reading and rereading often. Definitely recommend that to anyone kind of, thinking about, being a founder, or even just thinking about how startups really work and what you should and should not be doing and the problems you should be working on. But also, it's the P Marker blog. So, Mark Andreessen writes a lot, and he's got a collection of about, I think, about 12 to 15, blog posts that I've, compiled into what they call the P Marker book. It's all about the stuff that any founder, anyone is thinking. What happens if you don't get the investors that what is product market? Actually, no, the product market blog post was actually from there as well. The whole idea of product market, was pushed quite strongly by Mark Andreessen. So it was from there as well. A rich collection of blogs that I really kind of go to. So those are the two things that I think I read through often as well. In terms of engineering and stuff, there's a lot of lectures and sort of maths books that I kind of read through. So yeah. I often do read and reread a lot of the stuff by Ian Goodfellow. He's a machine learning, he's an AI researcher and stuff, and I really do his work.
And so where can people reach you or Alex if they wanted to collaborate or reach out to you guys?
Kind of drop me a message on X. It's ZK108. Just sort of direct message me and stuff. The handle of the company is Valyu Network, VALYU. Network, NETWORK. As for LinkedIn, feel free to kind of reach out to me. It's linkedin.com/HJ Pithadia. Same thing with Alex. So, you can find him on LinkedIn, just Alexander Ng, and he's probably one of the first people that will most likely come up as well. I want to say that I know his X handle, but let me just look it up. Yeah. So Alex's X handle is Alex Khan Skrt. So AlexCantSkrt. Yeah. He skates often, so yeah.
Like, who are you looking to meet? Any specific people you want to reach out?
I mean, I'd kind of speak to as many people building in the AI space, whether they're building at the application level, at the infrastructure level, I just want to understand and kind of just speak to them. So anyone kind of that space, definitely. Anyone thinking about, kind of building and working in the ad space, weirdly enough, I'd love to kind of speak to that's a user group as well. And there's definitely, content writers as well that I'd love to. But more important, any founder, I just love speaking, connecting with founders. We're at a stage where, I probably had the same problems they have. I might have problems that they have, learning from their experiences, thinking things. I'll do a couple of shameless plugs as well, if that's okay.
Absolutely, go for it.
So we do write a lot about how we think of things and build stuff as well. So feel free to follow our blog. So it's valyu.network, and then you can just find our blog section there. So we're going to really recommend that as a resource. The other thing that we did, I think, just a couple of days ago was released what we call our context API. It's essentially a way for any AI developer or build kind of access high quality premium data sources at a very sort of low price point. And, we're giving a free free tier as well. So if you kind of look through, destroy that product, do whatever you need to, and give us a lot of feedback.
I'll drop the links on the show notes. But yeah, thank you for your time, and it was a fun chat, and it was lovely having you here.
I enjoyed this conversation, Vishesh, and I do kind of appreciate you kind of having me.
If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever your favorite podcast app is. See you in the next episode.